Okay. Hi, thank you very much for coming to this presentation. We're going to be talking about identity, all things identity, an identity overview. My name is Gayana Begdasarian, and I'm a technical writer in Windows Server in the identity space. I have written content for Active Directory, Active Directory Federation services, and also Windows Azure Access Control Service. So my main objective today is to show you how we at Microsoft view identity. And more specifically, I'm going to talk about some of the key identity trends and challenges. I'm going to talk about the 4 pillars of identity as they have been defined by our Microsoft architect engineers and how important these pillars can be in implementing an identity infrastructure in your organization. And I also have a couple of really cool demos for implementing multi-factor authentication and multi-factor access control using Active Directory Federation services in the upcoming release of Windows Server 2012 R2. So that's what we're going to do today. It's a pretty conceptual session. I have a lot of information to cover, so if I may humbly ask you to please keep your questions until the end, unless they are really short and I can quickly address them and move on, I would really appreciate that. And also, the Ask the Experts is happening tonight, right after this. I think it's in the dining hall, so keep that in mind. Okay, so first, let's talk about some of the key industry trends that force us to reconsider what we think and how we think about identity. And I want to mention 3 in particular: explosive data growth, budgetary constraints, and the proliferation of devices. So as we become more and more connected, as we scale our applications to the cloud, or as we onboard customers and partners, there's an avalanche of data that we must consume. And it's not just identity data, it's also businesses, processes, analytics, all sorts of data. And once it's all assembled, we need to make sure that it is kept meaningful, that we provide access control for this data, and that redaction occurs. And coincidental with this massive amount of data is the ever-growing number of identities that want to consume this data. So how do we provide meaningful and robust sets of access control for all of these identities? The other trend, budgetary constraints, not exactly new, has always been the case because corporate IT is always expected to do more with less. So if we can provide you with tools and processes that just work and require little effort to deploy and implement, then we empower you to spend more time and effort on growing your business, your company's mission, and growing the careers of your employees. And of course, the proliferation of devices. It's a super important trend. In fact, if some of you have attended the keynote yesterday morning, it's no longer a trend really, it's a reality that we're faced with. In the past, customers and employees were not allowed to bring their smartphones or tablets or their own devices into the corporate IT because none of these devices were managed by corporate IT, and therefore they could not be trusted. And yet now we're encouraging people to be mobile, to connect from anywhere on any device, and consequently we need to come up with an identity story for all of these devices. So what are some of the challenges that we are faced with as we try to adapt to what is in trend? The first bucket of challenges that I want to talk about is in access control, because let's face it, access control is at the heart of pretty much every identity-related task or challenge that you have. And there's 2 that I want to mention in particular: secure access for BYOD, bring your own devices, and the customer and partner access to data. So as new users are introduced to your environment with all of their devices, we need to make sure that these devices are trusted. So here's a list of some of the factors that you can use when you are developing a device, an identity story for devices in your environment. Is it a managed or an unmanaged device? What operating system is it running? Is it on a public or a private network? Does it require encryption? Does it require strong password requirement? Anyway, I'm not going to read through all of them, but I'm sure if any of you are implementing BYOD scenarios in your identity infrastructures, these are some of the things that you are thinking about right now. Customer and partner access to data. Why is external-facing identity infrastructure a challenge? Well, it's because most of our protected resources, corporate resources, are not really built for external use. They're built for internal consumption only. Like, for example, you might have a SharePoint site or an application that you only want your employees to access. And then suddenly you have to onboard a partner, or there's a merger, or you make an acquisition, and you have to inject external identities into this app, and you realize that this app was not really written for that. It authenticates users against some local database that is very specific to this application, so you have a big problem. So here's a list of some of the problems or challenges that you are faced with as you are implementing this element of an identity infrastructure, like injecting external identities into an internal application or into an internal process, creating a dedicated identity infrastructure to support a single application, maybe creating a partition in your identity infrastructure that your partners can manage, things like that. I'm going to move on, but in my later slides, I actually have a couple of links to the 2 white papers that I published earlier this year, and this talk is based on them. So if you don't get to read through all of this, all of that information is in those 2 white papers. Another bucket of challenges, infrastructure management. The last thing that you would want is to have a highly scalable application and resource model, and then have an identity infrastructure that hinders the scalability. So if you scale your applications to the cloud, and if you don't have an identity story that supports these cloud-based applications, you have a big problem because nobody can log in. So you have to scale your identities as well into the cloud. And if you do, you're going to be onboarding a huge number of users. So you have to do it rather quickly with the least amount of overhead. And that means that you will need a significant amount of automation. And probably you'll need to enable your users with some self-management capabilities like self-password reset, self-service password reset, or self-registration, things like that. So the bottom line is that your identity story or your identity infrastructure needs to support your scalability into the cloud. Oh, went too far. Handling mergers and acquisitions, another challenge. When 2 companies started building their environments, they did not really anticipate the day when they would merge and become one company and have a need for a unified directory, or that most of their applications and services would need to query data from a foreign source. So the biggest problem here is the overlap that you will have in applications the 2 companies might have, and also huge differences in the identity schemas. And finally, adapting current identity infrastructures to the cloud. Identity management-related issues are oftentimes seen as a complete deployment blocker for moving into the cloud. Because not only do you have to move your applications, you also probably have to move your identities as well. And when you do that, that introduces a whole bunch of issues on keeping the data in sync between on-prem and the cloud, making sure that whatever access controls you have work across on-prem and the cloud, or whatever entitlements you have work. Okay, and the last bucket of challenges, security. Talk about rapid response, protecting while extending, and reporting and auditing. So if a problem occurs, if something goes wrong, you need to know who did it. You need to know what was the identity or who was the person responsible. You need to know how they got access, when did the problem occur, and how were they granted the entitlement that allowed them to get access to your application. And you need to know these answers really quickly, because the quicker you know, the quicker you can respond and fix things. Protecting while extending. So as you onboard customers and partners and expand the boundaries of your organization, you inherently become more vulnerable. And not only do you have to make sure that all of your identities and people are properly identified, you also have to have a very good handle on whatever entitlements you have in place, and a good mechanism for managing the entitlements, granting, revoking, things like that. And of course, reporting and auditing, very often neglected in most identity infrastructures and identity stories, and yet having a very strong reporting and auditing system can definitely guarantee you better security. So having said all that, I want to say a few words about the importance of identity, and actually what do I mean when I say an identity infrastructure? In a nutshell, it is a collection of processes, technologies, and policies for managing digital identities and how these identities gain access to your protected resources. That's what an identity story is. And it is a concept that spans your entire environment. It starts from the infrastructure and it goes to the applications and services and back to the users and devices that try to gain access to your applications and services. Now, traditionally, we used to think about identity only in terms of users. And only recently, we started thinking that device identity is equally as important. Again, BYOD. Yesterday at the keynote, they devoted a lot of time to this. So Yes, identity is equally important for devices and for users. Oops. So now there's a consensus that pretty much anything and everything that enters your protected environment from wherever, extranet, internet, must have an identity associated with it. Having a strong identity story really can make or break your business. It can either keep you from being cloud ready, or it can make you very adaptive to the ever-increasing user workloads and facilitate your transition into the cloud. You can use identity to empower your users. You can grant your users self-management capabilities like self-service password reset or self-registration, and thus significantly reduce the cost of managing all of these identities. You can also use identity to take control of your environment. You might have thousands of applications in your environment, and each one of them has a different security system or a different authentication policy, authorization policy, and yet with having a good and solid identity story, you can unify access control for all of the applications in your environment. And finally, you can use identity to plan for the future. And the future is hybrid IT. It's infrastructures that have presence both in the cloud and on-prem. So do you want to move your applications to the cloud? Does it mean that you have to move your identities as well? How do you keep the data in sync between on-prem and the cloud? When you are starting to plan an identity infrastructure, or you're planning improvements to your identity infrastructure, you must keep hybrid IT in mind, because that is the future. And so, having said all that, here's the cornerstone of my presentation, the 4 pillars of identity as they are defined by Microsoft. We believe that a strong and healthy and flexible identity infrastructure must consist of the processes, policies, and technologies that are derived from these 4 pillars. And they are administration, auditing, authentication, and authorization. So I'm going to talk about the administration and auditing pillars at a very high level, and then dive more deeply into authentication and authorization. And there's a couple of reasons why I want to do that. Number one, these are massive pillars. They're very complex. There's a lot of things that can be said about them, and an hour and 15 minutes is really not enough time to do each one of them full justice. And the second reason is both of the demos that I have, multi-factor authentication and multi-factor access control, they actually align under the authentication and authorization pillars. So I want to spend a little bit more of my time on that and dive a little deeper and cover some of the concepts that you need to know in order to understand my demos. So let's start with the administration. This is about creating or establishing a centralized and accurate view of an identity, be that user's identity or device's identity. And when I say centralized, I don't mean just one view, because an identity can change depending on the context. Like a user's identity can be one thing between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., and something completely different during non-working hours. And similarly, a device's identity can change based on context. Device's location might change, or whoever happens to be the currently logged on user, or the ever-changing security or configuration status. The bulk of this pillar is provisioning. And this is a really important capability to consider as you are implementing an identity infrastructure in your organization. And capability involves things like updating and synchronizing your identities. And when you're handling provisioning tasks, you're going to be dealing with issues around workflow, this thing called change control, and handling requests and approvals. So speaking of change control, whenever you introduce a change into your identity story or identity infrastructure, you really don't want to enable this change to propagate immediately. You want to have some processes in place. You want to give a little timeout for this change. You want to execute some kind of control over the identity and this change and how the change proliferates throughout your system. A lot of administrators go straight into their directory service, like people can go straight into their Active Directory users and computer snap-in and change an attribute of an identity, like change a user's password, and not do anything else. Well, the problem with that approach is that you have no change control if you do that. You don't have a mechanism in place that can tell you in the future who made this change, why it was made, and no timeout for the attribute change. So basically, you don't give yourself any time to, pun intended, change your mind. And this can throw off any compliance reporting you might have or bypass any attestation controls that you might have in place. And when it comes to entitlements in this pillar, in a nutshell, you basically need three things. You need processes that can help you figure out how a user got entitled to access a certain app, processes for tracking how people are exercising their entitlements, and processes for managing entitlements. So if you can tell how somebody got access, how this access is being used, and if you have a good mechanism for granting and revoking entitlements, then you will be able to tell a cohesive story if you need to audit this user or the event that led to their access to a system or a resource within a system. So very high level, it's pretty much everything I want to say about the administration pillar. Let's move on to auditing. This one is about who did what, when, and how did they get access to do what they did. And this is probably the most commonly overlooked pillar in pretty much all of the identity infrastructures. And ironically, I'm going to spend a little time on this myself. It's a very complex pillar. It's huge. It's absolutely enormous. And the most difficult thing here is that all of this data that you will need to filter through and harvest and process is in so many different locations. There are so many different logs. There are web service logs and custom logs and error logs and event logs, all sorts of logs. Logging has become quite ubiquitous. And cloud computing, if you have a cloud element in your identity or in your infrastructure, it only makes this problem even worse. So it's really up to you to decide how easy or how difficult it is for you to process and filter and harvest all of this data. And this is even more complicated if you have a federation scenario with other organizations, because it's very difficult to correlate audit trails across organizations. There will be a bunch of issues that you will need to deal with around legal issues, operational issues. So it's highly recommended that you have some explicit agreements on log sharing, things like which logs of the other organization will you be able to access? Who in your organization should be able to have permission to access those logs? What is the wait time to access these logs? And what are some of the retention policies that another organization might have around their logs? And another problem is the nature of the data that you will find in these logs. Sometimes it can be incorrect because it has been tampered with, or heterogeneous, which is very difficult to process. It throws you off. Or just be undocumented, non-existent, because somebody didn't think that it was important, to capture this. Or it can be very superficial and completely useless. It's there, but you can't really do anything with it. Or it can be the other end of the spectrum, incredibly complex and difficult and go many, many layers deep. Trace and identity logging. So when it comes to identity, you really don't want to concern yourself too much with trace logs with error information in them, or error logs in them. What you want to look for is what did a person do over time. So for example, what time was this user authenticated? What IP address did this authentication request come from? Which applications did this identity try to access? So in other words, if you can know who had access, when did they have access, what did they do once they got access, and what happened after they got access, and finally, how did they get the right or the entitlement that allowed them to get access, then you will be able to tell a cohesive story and audit this user. So in a way, what you're doing is you're auditing the other three pillars, because the answers to all of these questions are, they line up either under the administration, authentication, or the authorization pillars. And finally, alerting. Very necessary for efficient and effective auditing, and we have some good point solutions at Microsoft for alerting, mostly in System Center land. They will provide alerts if administrative access has been compromised or abused or misconfigured in your system. Again, quite high level, so let's move on to authentication. So this pillar is all about how much assurance about a particular identity is enough. In other words, how much does an IT system need to know about a particular identity in order to have sufficient proof that they really are who they say they are? And this is a pretty complex pillar, so I'm going to talk about it in three sections: authentication strength, authentication delegation, and the end user experience. And I'll also mention a couple of key identity capabilities that line up under this pillar: multi-factor authentication, public identity provider federation, and single sign-on as part of the end-user experience. So let's start with the authentication strength. This is basically the quantity and the complexity of the proof factors about a particular identity. And traditionally, it has been, verifying the user secret, like username and password. But everybody agrees that this is no longer a viable option because these credentials can be very easily compromised, and very often the act of compromising them does not require a great level of expertise. You don't need to be a world-renowned hacker to mess with someone's credentials. So what can you do here? How can you solve this problem? Well, one thing that you can do is you can add more factors to your authentication. In other words, implement multi-factor authentication. And if you do that, a whole bunch of questions arise. Well, how many factors are going to guarantee you very strong authentication? How many are just enough? So the current trend is towards device-based two-factor authentication. And there are many options on the market available right now, like smart cards and USB tokens and soft tokens, SMS OTP, one-time password, smartphone push, phone factor. Microsoft has recently acquired phone factor for this very reason, biometrics, things like that. The phone-based authentication methods are incredibly popular right now. So basically, your phone becomes a one-time password generator. And the reason why the phone factor authentication is so popular is because people usually have their phones on them. So it's easy for them to use it as an authentication method. And the phone can be locked if it's lost, or it can even be erased if it is stolen. But the disadvantage of using phone factor as phones as one of the factors for authentication is that still not everybody has a smartphone. Yes, everybody in this building has a smartphone, but not everybody out there has a smartphone still. So if you are going to implement multi-factor authentication in your environment, that is going to be facing the public, available for public use, you want to make sure to use alternate methods that do not require smartphone access, at least not yet. Another problem with multi-factor authentication is that it's quite expensive. If you do that, and if you want to do it properly, you have to do it yourself. And that means that you're going to have to buy all those tokens and manage them and issue them and revoke them, and all those certificates that come with your tokens. So you got to do it yourself, and you can't really avoid the high costs that come with implementing it properly. Okay, so it's time for my first demo. A little change of pace. So what I'm going to do here is show you how to implement multi-factor authentication using a server role called Active Directory Federation Services in Windows Server. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. I have spent the last 2 years writing content for ADFS, so I'm kind of partial to it. But before I actually show you the demo and explain a demo, I want to put a little disclaimer out there. What I'm about to show you and what I'm about to talk about, this is just a sneak peek or a little preview, and it's going to be covered in a lot more detail at those 2 sessions that are going to be happening tomorrow. One at 10:15 a.m. and one at 5 p.m. So there's a lot of great new functionality that has been added to Windows Server 2012 R2, that addresses BYOD, bring your own devices scenarios. So if you guys are interested in this, you want to go to those 2 sessions tomorrow. The top members of the ADFS product team are going to be handling those, and I just want to do a little sneak peek so that you know what's going on. And I'm only going to concentrate on MFA, and not even everything that you can do with MFA, just one small portion of it. So a few concepts before I'm going to do the demo. Traditionally, well, okay, first of all, what does ADFS do? Its central job is to create a token. So it authenticates into Active Directory, it collects users' credentials, these things we call claims or attributes, and it mints them into a token. And then it sends this token to an application that is secured by ADFS, and then when the user tries to authenticate to the application can make a decision whether or not they can authenticate, or even authorization, like what are some of the things that they can do once they gain access to the application. So how has the authentication mechanism or authentication policies have changed in ADFS from what's available now or what has been available in ADFS 2.0 to what's coming up? Basically, in addition to the default authentication method, we have added additional authentication methods. So the default or the primary authentication method is there to validate the user's identity, and the additional methods are there to provide stronger authentication. And if you want to implement MFA using ADFS, there's really two parts to it. You have to select another method, and then you actually have to set up a policy that will kick off or trigger MFA. And another very important element to this is the scope. You can set MFA in ADFS at a global scope, which means that it's going to apply to all of the applications that are secured by ADFS. Oh, and by the way, when I say application, I'm going to be talking about relying party or relying party trusts a lot. So what that is a digital representation of your application that is secured by ADFS. So what you do is you add a relying party trust, either programmatically with PowerShell or in the ADFS management console, and that's how you secure your application with ADFS. So yeah, you can do it globally, and it's going to apply to everything that's secured by ADFS, or you can set up an MFA policy for a particular application that's going to be specific to that application. And the reason why we did that is because all of your applications are different. Some of them are really sensitive, and some of them are not so much. Like if you have a simple client chat, username and password is perfectly fine for something like that. But if you have a finance application, it's probably a good idea to add more factors. So I'm going to switch to this machine. Actually, it's 8. Okay, so this is my test environment, and I have 4 things here. Here's my client machine. This is what I'm going to use to access a web-based application. Here's my IIS server. It's basically a web server that actually hosts my claims-based application. It's just a simple web app. It doesn't do very much. It basically is going to display tokens that are going to be generated as I authenticate. Then I have the domain controller. This domain controller hosts an Active Directory domain. The reason I need an Active Directory domain is because every federation server, in order to be functional, has to be joined to an Active Directory domain. And in this domain, I have 2 accounts. I have a test user account, and I have a test group account. And the test user account is added to the test group account. And I'm going to use these 2 accounts to access my application. And last but not least, most important, here's my federation server. So this is what I'm going to use to set up MFA. So the first thing I'm going to do, actually, is just going to navigate to the app and make sure that I can access it before I set anything up. So really wish I had a bigger screen. And I'm going to log in with that test user account. And I can't type today. Okay, here we go. I can sign in, everything is fine. Great. So now let's go to the ADFS box and set up the multi-factor authentication. So like I said, I'm going to do it in 2 parts. The first part is select a method, and we're going to do that globally. So I go into here. This is the Active Directory Federation Services Management Console. And there's a new node called Authentication Policies. So this is where you set up global settings. And then there's per relying party trust, specifically for whatever applications you want to do this for. So I'm going to click on Edit. Or you can also do that from the Actions pane. And I'm going to select the method here. So I'm going to select Certificate Authentication. As you can see, Phone Factor is also configured in this lab, but I'm not going to do that right now. If you're interested in Phone Factor, it's like a deeper dive on the little demo that they did during Keynote yesterday. Go to those 2 sessions tomorrow. That's exactly what those guys are going to do. And actually, in my demo, I'm not going to take you through the whole certificate authentication. I'm just going to show you how to set up a policy that will trigger MFA. So we did this. Let's do... Oh boy. Completely stuck. Trying to, yeah. Very difficult. Here we go. Okay. And now we're going to go to per relying party trust. So here's my application. I have already added it as a relying party trust. And I'm going to right-click and go into Edit Custom Multi-Factor Authentication Settings. And here I can pivot my policy 3 ways. I can either use user data. That's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to set up a policy whereby if you belong to a certain group and you try to gain access to this application, you're going to be prompted for MFA, for additional authentication. Or I can pivot it by devices, if it's a registered device or unregistered device, or I can pivot it by location, extranet or internet. So let's do add, test group, check name, OK, apply, and OK. And now let's go back and try to gain access to this application. Excuse me?
Those conditions, are they cumulative?
What do you mean?
Well, I can specify both group, extranet.
Yes. Yeah. No, ADFS 2.1 is what's currently available in Windows Server 2012. This is what's coming up in Windows Server 2012 R2. So the preview is coming up in June, and that's where this stuff is going to be available. Okay, so let's try to access this application again. And here we go. For security reasons, we require additional information to verify your account. So that's how you set up MFA. Small tip of the iceberg of what you can do with MFA in the upcoming version of ADFS. So let me erase this policy and take my system back to a neutral state so I can do my second demo later on. Just a second. Okay. There are a few more things that I want to say in the general area of the authentication strength. I want to talk about Public Identity Provider Federation. So what I mean by that is allowing users to access your corporate resources or your protected resources using public credentials. And these are credentials that they can get from any email or social networking based site. Things like Yahoo, Facebook, Google, whatever. So if you do that, you do enhance your identity infrastructure with letting people log in with free accounts, which is great because they're free and because you don't have to manage these accounts. The public identity providers are going to manage them for you. But the huge disadvantage of using Public Identity Provider Federation is the fundamental lack of assurance that is inherently associated with the concept of public identity. Because anybody can sign up for a free Microsoft account or Google or Facebook or Yahoo. There's absolutely no way that you can prove that these people really are who they say they are. And if you want to take on, if you want to really prove as a service provider or an application provider that these identities are genuine, you really must take on the burden of proving them yourself. And another big disadvantage of using Public Identity Provider Federation is that you have no control over the password policies of these public identity providers. So if you're going to do this, it's a good idea to enhance it with some authentication strength. Like maybe you can put an enforcement layer between the user and the application and require the user to provide additional credentials like a fact or a combination of facts about themselves before they gain access to the application. This is actually the essence of the Aegis solution, which was implemented at Microsoft a couple of years ago. And I think it was highlighted at TechEd maybe last year or maybe a couple of years ago. Another thing that you can do is you can have your own public identity provider, and you can force your users to buy, credentials on your own identity provider. Then you have proof that they really are legitimate. Okay, authentication delegation, another big bucket here. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Can you share anything about what Microsoft's doing with regard to U.S. federal digital identities, and so another identity provider could assert a certain level of assurance for that identity, and via third-party audits, you can trust those levels of assurance?
I'm not sure I know of a solution that does all this, but I do know a couple of people who work on this, are architect engineers. So if you want to come up afterwards, or my email is going to be there, or find me tomorrow at the CSI booth, and I'll take your information. I'll definitely pass it on to them.
Okay, yeah, I'm talking specifically about FICAM.
Yeah. Okay, authentication delegation. So this is about establishing a trust with another organization or organizations who are going to provide you with an already authenticated, validated, federated identity. So for example, you can have trust with Contoso, authentication delegation trust with Contoso, and that means that a Contoso employee can have access to your protected resource. And if that person's employment with Contoso terminates, you don't need to change any of your access controls. You don't need to, revoke his entitlements. The Contoso decommissioning process is going to take care of that. So it's a huge advantage of doing this is you don't have to manage the identities. But you are establishing a trust. So you're making yourself more vulnerable. So you really need to make sure how strong is your trust. And if it's improperly implemented, it can seriously weaken your identity story or your identity infrastructure. Because you're trusting the other organization to verify all of the identities for which they are issuing credentials. And you're trusting the security mechanisms of the other organization to ensure that there's not going to be a rogue administrator who will pose as a valid user in your environment and wreak havoc on all of your resources. You're also trusting the other organization to retain audit logs and share them with you in case you need to correlate logs and correlate activities if something goes wrong. And you're trusting that all of the entitlements that are being handed by this other organization to all of these identities are actually legitimate. So it's really highly recommended that you supplement authentication delegation with some MFA or asymmetric cryptography, some strong authentication. And finally, I want to talk about the end user experience. So what will your users actually be faced with? What will they see as they try to gain access to your applications and services? And I want to highlight 4. Disjointed sign-on, global sign-on, reduced sign-on, and of course, single sign-on. So with disjointed sign-on, this means that you have multiple credentials and you have to enter them over and over and over again as you try to gain access to the applications and services within your environment. Far from ideal, very annoying, nobody likes that. Global sign-on, this means that you have one set of credentials, but every time you try to access different applications and services, you're still being prompted to enter them. So this is a slight improvement over disjointed sign-on, but still kind of far from ideal. Reduced sign-on means that you can move all of your applications, or some of them, however many you want to, under a single authenticator. And so for those applications, you will actually have a single sign-on experience, but not for all of them. And then, of course, there's the single sign-on, the holy grail of authentication, the elusive single sign-on experience. So in a true textbook integrated single sign-on experience, you have one set of credentials, you enter them once, you gain access to all of the applications and services within your environment, and you're never being prompted to enter them ever again, which would be totally awesome. And it's very important to not think about SSO as a product. It is not a product. I don't know of any product that you can buy and deploy and boom, you have single sign-on in your environment. What it is an outcome of a very well-architected solution. And you can use a whole bunch of products. You can use products from Microsoft or third party. In fact, all of the identity-related products that Microsoft makes they have something to do with single sign-on. They're somehow related to single sign-on. And there are 3 ways that you can implement single sign-on. You can create a central token issuer, like a directory. For example, you can use Active Directory. Actually, it's important to note that even if you integrate all of your apps with a directory, this does not guarantee you single sign-on because both the client and the authentication protocol have to be conducive to SSO. If they're not, it's not going to work. Active Directory will work because it uses Kerberos, but if you use a directory that uses LDAP for authentication, single sign-on is not going to work because it's not in the nature of that protocol. The other thing that you can do is you can establish a credential forwarder. So in other words, you put something in front of the application, which will gather the credential and then respond with the proper protocol in the back end. And the third thing that you can do is you can implement protocol transitions. You take one thing and you turn it into something completely different. Like you can take a SAML token, security assertion markup language token, and you can turn it into a Kerberos ticket. So why is it so sought after? Why does everybody want to implement single sign-on? And there are many reasons to it. People want to reduce high password-related help desk costs, or maybe somebody wants to implement a joint workstation. But I think the most deeply seated reason for implementing SSO is that people just want to improve the experience that their end users will encounter as they try to gain their resources and applications. So when somebody asks you to implement single sign-on, the challenge is not what applications you're going to use. The challenge is, first, ask this customer or ask these people exactly how do they define single sign-on? What are their requirements? What are their expectations? Is it really single sign-on that they want? And then the second challenge is do an inventory of all of their resources and applications and make sure that they are going to work with your single sign-on approach, with how you're going to try to implement single sign-on for them, because it might not be the case. Not everything might work. So for example, if somebody, let's say a company wants to implement single sign-on and they're thinking about buying FIM, Forefront Identity Manager from Microsoft. In this scenario, your job is to tell them, no, FIM is not going to give you single sign-on. FIM is going to give you synchronized password experience, so at best you're going to have same sign-on, but not SSO. Yep. Can you come up to the microphone because I can't hear you? Thank you.
Isn't FIM supposed to be the part of the administration part of it, rather, and maybe some of the audit part of it, rather than the authentication? Because authentication is mostly with AD and ADFS, correct?
All of these pillars, we separate them into 4 pillars, but they're all highly relatable and interconnected. So they're really, this is how we define it, just to give an overview of identity, but it's all identity infrastructure. All of these tasks and challenges are interconnected and related. So SSO, nearly impossible to implement without a major overhaul to all of your applications and services, which is extremely expensive and difficult to do, and not everybody wants to do that. In fact, probably nobody wants to do that. And the reason for that is you might have thousands of applications in your environment, and each one of them has a different security model, different authentication policies, different authorization policies. So unless you bring them all under one directory, or unless you bring them under a protocol or a set of protocols that support transition, how are you going to implement single sign-on? It's very difficult. And all of them are written on multiple platforms. They vary greatly. There's a high chance that there's some commercial off-the-shelf app that somebody has, and there's very little you can do to plug it into your SSO implementation approach. But if all of your applications were integrated with Active Directory, for example, if you had a central token issuer, then implementing SSO would probably be a relatively straightforward and easy task. Okay. And finally, authorization. So this pillar is about making the best access control decision possible. In other words, you're examining the identity information and you decide if they should get access to an application, and most importantly, what is it that they can do once they gain access. And authorization can be very application specific, or it can be completely abstracted from your application. SharePoint, for example, is it's a great example of an application with very highly integrated authorization capabilities. So I want to talk about fine-grained and coarse-grained authorization. Coarse-grained authorization, it's a common mistake to think of coarse-grained authorization in terms of, for example, URL access. Like I can access URL 1 but not URL 2, even though they're both in the same app. That's not coarse-grained authorization. What it is brokering access to your application as a whole, whether or not somebody can get in. And if it's properly implemented, it is completely abstracted from your application. In fact, in some of the best coarse-grained authorization implementations, the application is not even aware that there's coarse-grained authorization that is being applied on its behalf. Now, on the other hand, fine-grained authorization is very operation-specific, very application-specific, and it's implemented in many layers within the application. And each system needs both. You need both fine-grained, coarse-grained and fine-grained authorization. So I want to talk a little bit about access control. actually take a step back. So we separate, and this addresses your question in a way, we separate authentication and authorization into two separate pillars. But really, they are really very interconnected and relatable. And together, they form this thing called access control. And access control is at the heart of every identity-related task or challenge. So there are 4 levels or 4 different types of access control that I want to highlight. Role-based, attribute-based, policy-based, and risk-based. Role-based access control, very, very popular, probably the oldest, used by most of the companies that have more than 500 employees. So what you do is you create roles within the organization for particular job functions, and then you assign permissions to these roles to perform certain operations. And we have several solutions for RBAC, role-based access control, like Behold. It can be integrated with FIM. And we also have Authorization Manager, which is the MMC snap-in, Microsoft Management Console. It's available both on the client and server OS. Attribute-based access control, this is the one that I love because I've spent the last 2 years writing content, first for Windows Azure ACS and then ADFS. So with attribute or claims-based access control, what you do is you examine claims or attributes about an identity to make an access control or authorization decision. And claims, it's a bit of data about a user, and it can be absolutely anything. Their name, location, their hair color, social security number, address, absolutely anything. And we have several solutions for attribute or claims-based access control. And the easiest thing to do is to collect attributes from Active Directory. And you can do that via LDAP protocol or by using Active Directory Services interface in .NET. So what happens is your application authenticates into Active Directory on behalf of the user. And it does that either with a dedicated service account or with a delegated Kerberos ticket. And it collects the necessary application. So this is great for internal apps. But what are you going to do for external applications, like web-based applications? Well, what you can do is you can secure them with ADFS. You can make them claims aware. That's exactly what I did in my first demo, and the second demo uses the same lab, so we're going to do the same thing. And so in that scenario, ADFS acts as an intermediary. It will gather the claims or the attributes from Active Directory or other third-party directories that you might have plugged into the solution, and it will mint a token. Traditionally, it has been, like with ADFS 2.0 and 2.1, it's a SAML token, and we use WSFed protocol to transport them to the app. Now we're also going to support JOT tokens, and we've added support for auth protocol. And so once this information gets to the application then can make a decision whether or not the user should be let in and gain access to the app. And then we also have Access Control Service, which is part of Windows Azure. And basically, it's the same thing as ADFS. It's in the cloud. And in addition to working with Active Directory credentials via ADFS, because ACS treats ADFS as an identity provider, it also supports credentials from Yahoo, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft account, formerly known as LiveID. Policy-based access control is becoming increasingly popular. And actually, it's very specific to authorization. So what you do is you make a determination or you make an access control decision that is based either on a defined policy or on the user attribute or the resource attribute. So you have a policy decision maker somewhere in your environment, and this policy decision maker examines the credential and then makes an access control decision. And this can be quite important for cloud computing because as you start moving your applications back and forth from on-prem and the cloud, eventually you're going to get to a point where most of your applications, or at least those that work across both on-prem and the cloud, will need to query the same policy store, regardless of where the data is. So this could be a good type of access control to use if you have a cloud element in your organization, in your infrastructure. And finally, risk-based access control. This is actually pretty cool. I don't think we have a solution at Microsoft for this one yet. So this is specific for authentication, but I'm going to mention it here anyway. You see, these pillars are really highly relatable. So what this does is it examines an identity, and then it determines a risk profile that is associated with the transaction of this identity trying to gain access to an application or a service. And it can be a different kind, it can be a higher risk profile or it can be a lower risk profile. If it's higher, then we're going to be prompted for stronger authentication. If it's lower, then maybe a static username and password is going to be good enough. So in other words, the application challenges the user only when it's appropriate, or the authentication strength is adapted to different circumstances. So for example, if for the past week the authentication requests were coming from an IP address 3,000 miles away, and then today suddenly it's not, there's a high chance that this person is not supposed to have access. Let's throw an additional authentication method and see what happens. Okay, so I think it's time for my last demo. This time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up an authorization policy in ADFS. And I'm going to deny access to my claims-based application to all of the users who belong to a particular group. But before I do that, once again, go to those 2 sessions tomorrow. All of this is going to be covered in a lot more detail. This is just a small tip of the iceberg of what you can do with multi-factor access control in ADFS. So like I said, the central job of ADFS is to issue a token. And then what you do with the information that's contained within this token, with the claims, you do it by defining claim rules. And you set up these claim rules in the ADFS management console, or you can do it via PowerShell. And to make access control decision or authorization decisions, you use a special type of claim rules called authorization issuance rules. So when I say I'm going to set up an authorization policy, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to set up an authorization issuance rule, and that's how we're going to deny access to the users who belong to a certain group. So what has changed with authorization in ADFS in Windows Server 2012 R2 is that you can now use more claim types as you are setting up an authorization rule. So there are a bunch of claim types now that are based on device data, the location, extranet, intranet, and also even like multi-factor authentication if you set up whatever authentication type that you might have set up. So this time I'm going to go into, it's the same test environment, so I'm going to go to my relying party trusts in the ADFS management console. And I can either right-click or go to the actions pane, and I'm going to do edit claim rules. You know what? First, I'm going to go back and just make sure that I can access this app. Oops. Okay, yes I can. Everything is great. Okay, so edit claim rules, and I'm going to go into the issuance authorization rule tab. So whenever you secure an application by ADFS, or whenever you add a relying party trust, it's the same thing, this rule is being created by default. So permit access to all users, but that's not what I want my policy to do, so I'm actually going to remove this rule. And I'm going to add a new rule, and this is the template that I'm going to use. Permit or deny users based on an incoming claim. So let's call it test rule. And this is what I was talking about. This is where you have a whole bunch of new claims that you can use, a bunch of new device-based claims. So I'm going to use a claim group SID, because we're going to pivot it by users group membership data. What happened to my group SID? Here we go. Okay. And we're going to deny access to all users with this incoming claim. That's it. Now let's go back to my client box and try to gain access to this application again. Test user. occurred. You are not authorized to access this site. So, by the way, all of these messages and this whole, the whole screen is completely customizable. So again, how to customize the end user experience is going to be covered in those 2 sessions tomorrow. So that is pretty much, that's the end of my second demo. Let's see, what else do I have in here? So you can find me tomorrow if you have any more questions. I'm going to be at the CSI booth, and there's my email address if you need anything else. I think some people had questions about FIM. I'll be there all day tomorrow and then in the morning on Thursday. Some additional resources that I threw in there. The 2 white papers that I have mentioned, the 4 pillars of identity and the identity infrastructure capabilities. So this is pretty much all of this information that I just covered in greater detail. So check those out. I also put in the ADFS content map because ADFS versioning is a little bit tricky. There's ADFS 2.0, there's ADFS that's available in Windows Server 2012 R2. Now there's going to be ADFS in this one. So this is like a good survival guide, and it has links to pretty much all the content that we have on ADFS. And then also I put a link to the directory integration overview. We have great content there on how to implement single sign-on for Office 365 apps using ADFS. So if you're interested in that, that's a good link to check out. And on MSDN, this is some content on access control service. Basically the same thing as ADFS, only in the cloud. And then these are some of the general resources that are available to you. Channel 9, TechNet, MSDN, MS Learning. If you want to earn these wonderful prizes, please evaluate the session. And you can do that by scanning this tag on any phone that you have, any smartphone. And that is it.